So basically the endocrine and the nervous system, it's like protecting the body and also enabling the body functions. Between them working with each other, it's just nervous system is fast, endocrine is slow. The nervous system uses neurotransmitters as the messenger. The endocrine system is going to use hormones. A hormone, this is an important sentence right here. A hormone is a chemical messenger. If I ask you what a hormone is, it's basically a chemical that sends a message to somewhere to tell something, to do something, to stop something, to maintain something, and it has to go through the bloodstream. And again, similar to, you know how the neurotransmitter needs its receptor, okay? It's like a lock and key. Acetylcholine doesn't have an effect everywhere, only where there's an acetylcholine receptor. The endocrine system is similar. It's going to release hormones, and there's going to be a target for that hormone, meaning they're going to have a receptor for that hormone. So it's not going to have its effect anywhere except for that location. So basically, hormones are produced by endocrine glands to be secreted in the bloodstream. That's the basics. Only produce their effect. And then if I say it's a target, it means that that has a receptor. For example, I'm just going to keep using the bone marrow. The bone marrow has a receptor for erythropoietin. So erythropoietin has to bind to the receptor on the bone marrow. Therefore, the bone marrow can produce red blood cells. So it's kind of interesting. Erythropoietin doesn't produce the red blood cells. It tells the bone marrow, and the bone marrow produces the red blood cells. Okay. Now, there's different hormone groups. The only one that I was going to stress is there's something called steroid hormones, and they come from cholesterol. And if you think about cholesterol, think oil. And if you have a hormone and it's oil, it's usually hydrophobic, because oil and water are, remember, hydrophobic has the fear of water, doesn't penetrate the cell, so it needs to be bound to a transport protein. And then the protein can take the steroid hormone into the cell. When this comes into play, and you guys that have been in practice, we do a lot of thyroid testing in animals. Thyroid disease is fairly common. I'm always frustrated when my boss is like, do a thyroid test. And I'm like, well, there's like 5 different ones in the book, in the lab book. Which do you want me to pick? But one test tests for something called T4 and free T4. And what that means is there's a certain amount of T4 in the blood that's going to be bound, and there's a certain amount of the hormone that's going to be free, that's unbound. And so we have a test that will measure free versus bound, and that's what that means. So I do want you to know the steroid hormones have to be bound, but there's always going to be some that doesn't bind. And that's part of the thyroid hormone that's not going to be as effective, because remember, it has to go into the cell. Steroid hormones have to go in the cell to cause their effect. So for example, say an animal had a high free T4 and a very low bound hormone. Maybe that's why the animal has thyroid disease, because too much is free, not enough is bound. So it makes sense. The whole control of this system, it's a whole feedback system. Okay, the level of hormone in the blood, how much hormone is in your blood, is either directly or indirectly gives feedback to the gland that produced it. And based on the feedback, you're going to get negative feedback, and you need to know the difference between negative and positive. Negative feedback happens when there's rising hormones in the blood. And that means that it's going to be stopped. Hormone production will be stopped. Positive feedback is activated when falling levels of the hormone are detected, and then hormone is increased. I have a really good analogy for this. Is everybody familiar with what a thermostat does in your house? If you've lived in your house, in an apartment, even in our building, you have a thermostat. And the thermostat controls what in your house? I mean, someone can type it or, yeah, the temperature. So say, for example, well, I'll use air conditioning because I was hot the other day. Came in the house, it was hot. Okay, I set a temperature. I set the house at like 72 degrees. It was like 75 degrees. So I was like, I need the house to be 72 degrees. So as soon as I set the temperature to be 72, the thermostat detected the house is hot. It turned on the air conditioning. The air conditioning ran and ran and ran. Okay. So what happens is, as soon as the temperature got down to 72, the air conditioning was turned off. That was negative feedback. Okay. Because what the thermostat did, the thermostat detected that the air conditioning was reaching temperature, like the air conditioning was rising. The amount of air conditioning in the house was rising. Once it reached the temperature I wanted, the thermostat gives negative feedback and it turns off the air conditioner. Well, then what happens? People go outside, open the doors. All of a sudden, the house starts warming up. And then all of a sudden, they're like, wait a minute, we have to add air conditioning back to the house. So then the positive feedback kicks in and the air conditioner gets turned on to add air or positively add air conditioning to the house. Does everybody understand that? How the thermostat monitors temperature, and it's going to either turn on. Now this could be heat, maybe heat makes more sense, but like in the winter, if your house is cold, all of a sudden the thermostat kicks on and it says we better positively add heat to the house. So what initiated that activity? Falling levels of heat in your house. Positive feedback adds heat to the house. Then all of a sudden the house reaches 74 degrees and then the activity is decreased or stopped because the rising level of heat in your home. So it's a whole feedback system. So the body is doing this with many, 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 all body functions are being monitored. So if I say it's negative feedback, that means the activity of a gland is going to be shut off. It's going to stop production of that hormone. If I say positive feedback, then that means there's not enough hormone. The gland is going to be activated and it's going to positively add hormone to the blood. Okay. Oh, I thought I lost my mouse. Now, again, remember I said in the brain, I'm going to talk about this first. Basically, the hypothalamus, it's part of the diencephalon. So you've got basically your main brain or your cerebrum here, and underneath here, you have the hypothalamus. Its basic job is to control the pituitary. If you remember when we studied the brain, I talked about the hypothalamus and I said, think of it like your body's thermostat. But it was basically like controlling thirst and temperature, but it does that via hormones. So that's what the hypothalamus does. Now, there is a link of blood vessels to the pituitary gland. So this kind of very strange structure is the pituitary gland. Then it has these connections, which let me get to the next slide. Basically, they're modified neurons. And what they do is the hypothalamus is going to produce a releasing factor or an inhibiting factor into the blood vessels, and those will match a pituitary hormone. So let me let me go back to my positive and negative feedback. If I need to have positive feedback, if the body needs hormone, the hypothalamus is going to send a releasing factor to the pituitary, and then the pituitary is going to link to a hormone and release it. So releasing factors release or positively add hormones. If those hormones go up, then the hypothalamus is going to detect that, and it's going to send an inhibiting factor to the pituitary. Then the pituitary factor is going to inhibit that hormone. And if I inhibit something, it's stopping, and then you're in negative feedback. Think inhibit, negative, stop. Stop, inhibit, you're negative. If you're inhibited, you're not doing something. Okay, now there are names for all these releasing and inhibiting factors. I'm not having you know that. We're only going to talk about the main hormones in the pituitary and in the body. The releasing and inhibiting, all you need to know is that there is a specific releasing factor that will increase levels of hormone, but it goes from the hypothalamus to the pituitary, then to the body, and then the inhibiting factor goes from the hypothalamus to the pituitary to the body, and it stops. Okay, so there is a factor, an inhibiting and releasing factor for every hormone in the pituitary. Okay, but all you need to know is if I'm releasing, I'm adding. If I'm inhibiting, I'm stopping. Releasing is positive feedback, positively adding. Inhibiting is the negative feedback, inhibiting negative or stopping. Okay, so hopefully, I think this is one of the hardest things to understand. Excuse me. It's not the Rona, I just have a tickle. Okay, so now in the hypothalamus, this is an important part. Normally the pituitary produces the majority of the hormones, besides the ones that are produced in the organs in the body. But in the pituitary, it produces hormones. But the hypothalamus produces two hormones, ADH and oxytocin. Do you remember me? What does ADH stand for? Does anyone remember? I'll give people a minute to type if they're typing, or everyone's going, nope. Yes, Teresa, antidiuretic hormone. So remember I said sometimes the hypothalamus is monitoring hydration of the body, the whole body. If the hypothalamus detects dehydration, it detects that, there's low levels of water, it is going to send, ADH is going to be released, and it's going to tell the kidney to not release oh, we have a guest. Does he want to say hi? Do you want to say hi? Is someone getting big? He's just going to say hi real quick. You say hi to everybody? Look how big I'm getting. So if you guys remember when I had him like day one, he's a big boy now. Say hi, everybody. Can you tell them what antidiuretic hormone? Say, it makes me pee less. That's what antidiuretic hormone does. But I drink a lot of water, so I don't have to worry about that. I don't get dehydrated, right? Do you get dehydrated? No, you don't. Okay. Wiggle worm. We'll go see Joey and Bo. Okay. Yeah, so I got him 3 weeks ago, and he was about 8.9 pounds, and now he's up to 17 pounds. Getting these big legs, getting to be a big boy. So sorry, but I figured that'd be a cute interruption. I don't know. He's figuring out, we had these little barriers of like a piece of wood and some baby gates or like leaning on things have worked for a while. And now he's figuring out, yeah. Yeah, Bo is Bo is mad at me right now. I actually had to take Bo to the vet. My friend is a vet on the south side. He owns Meridian Vet Clinic, if you're near Greenwood. And Bo's had some conjunctivitis. Like he had one goopy eye, and then it moved to both eyes, and then he was getting like this yellow discharge. And I was worried that it could be like autoimmune, like dry eye. I don't know if you guys have talked about eye stuff, because he had to have a shimmer tear test. He had to have stain. He had to have ocular pressures to make sure he didn't have any of the more serious eye disorders. And luckily, all his eye tests came back clear. It's just conjunctivitis. So he's on eye drops, which he loves me not. I have to shove him in a corner in the kitchen, and he's extremely strong. So it's been a lot of fun doing that. But so yes. So I think Bo is like, I'm staying away from mom because she's usually putting something or cleaning my eyes. Kind of like psycho about eye boogers. It's like an OCD thing for me. Anyway, so a little diversion there. But basically, the antidiuretic hormone is produced by the hypothalamus. But one important thing, it is stored in the posterior pituitary. So ADH is released from the posterior pituitary, but it is produced by the hypothalamus. So that if I ask you, and this is a perfect question for a teacher, what two hormones are produced by the hypothalamus? It's slide number 10, antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin. But remember I said yesterday I talked about the endocrine system like a big plant. If you think about it like a machinery plant, the hypothalamus owns the whole company, okay? But he's too busy to do his own work. So he has made those hormones, but he's like, well, I'm going to give them to you, pituitary, for you to store them and do them, to release them when I tell you to. So again, the pituitary is doing all the work, but I do want you to know about those two hormones. Now, the pituitary is basically, well, Bethany, that's a very good point. The hypothalamus is your CEO. The pituitary is your general manager. And then, for example, your thyroid, your pancreas, your kidney, those are all the managers of like the bottle making station and the cleaning people and the accounting department, if that makes sense. Each endocrine gland has a job, but they're under the direction of the pituitary, but the pituitary is still under influence from the hypothalamus. But the hypothalamus is like, I'm just going to sit here and tell you what to do, and then you can tell all your managers what to do. So that's kind of how I think of this system. It's like they all have a role, and the pituitary is very important. But basically, any hormone coming from the pituitary is released into the blood, but it has to get a nervous impulse from the hypothalamus. So basically, this little connection, they're called neurosecretory cells. The hypothalamus is going to send a signal to the pituitary, and then it's either going to send it via a releasing or an inhibiting factor, and then the pituitary is going to do. So hopefully so far we understand the connection between the hypothalamus and the pituitary and the two hormones produced by the hypothalamus. Now in the pituitary itself, if you look at it, it looks like one gland. It looks like one structure, and it is called the master endocrine gland. So everywhere in the body or in any book, it'll say, what is the master endocrine gland? It is the pituitary. Even though the hypothalamus is telling it what to do, the hypothalamus is part of the brain. It's not an endocrine organ. So the master endocrine organ or endocrine gland is the pituitary. Now, inside, it's technically two separate glands with different structures and different functions. When you look at it, it's one. Inside, there's two glands. There's an anterior and a posterior. You don't need to know adenohypophysis or neurohypophysis. I just want you to know the anterior pituitary and the posterior pituitary. The anterior is rostral, but remember, anything closer to your nose is rostral. So the anterior portion, which is rostral, produces hormones when stimulated. The anterior pituitary produces and releases hormones. The posterior pituitary is caudal, or it's in the back of the pituitary. It stores those two hormones. Remember, it stores ADH and oxytocin, and it releases hormones. I think about it this way. If you have a closet in the back of your house, the caudal part of your house, and it stores your coats for winter, and you get them out when it's cold outside. So the posterior pituitary is like a closet in the back of the pituitary, and it's holding on to ADH and oxytocin. And then when the hypothalamus says release them, sends a factor, then the posterior releases those hormones. But the anterior pituitary produces the majority of the hormones. And like I said, if you put yourself in the mind of a teacher, these are great questions. Where is ADH and oxytocin stored? What is the stimulus for them to be released? Which portion of the pituitary produces the majority of hormones? Okay, anterior produces and releases. Posterior is the storage closet in the back. It stores and releases. Okay, so somebody was sending me a message. Okay, so the list here is all of the anterior pituitary hormones. So this list on slide number 12 has all of the hormones. These are produced by the anterior pituitary and released by the anterior pituitary. The hypothalamus will send feedback to the anterior pituitary to release these. Now, the nice thing about some of these hormones, it literally has the clue in the name of what they do. Well, growth hormone, I wonder what that's responsible for. Maybe growing. Prolactin, lactation, prolactin. Thyroid stimulating hormone. Maybe I'm going to stimulate the thyroid. Now this one's a little different. Adrenocorticotropic hormone. Anytime, I want to give you a little tip. Anytime you see trope, T-R-O-P means growth. Okay? Trope means growth. So adrenal gland, cortex, adrenal cortex. This hormone is going to maintain growth of the adrenal cortex and release some of its hormones. Follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing melanocyte stimulating hormone. So we're going to go through what each of these does, but these are the ones that are in the anterior pituitary. So growth hormone, and just, you can do this, but it's also known as somatotropin. Soma means body. Trope means growth, body growth. Somatotropic hormone, or somatotropin is the noun. Somatotropic is the adjective describing the hormone. That's the difference in the spelling. Somatotropin, somatotropic hormone. So that's just a different way to say it. But I just want you to know growth hormone. It promotes body growth, and basically it helps regulate metabolism of all of their nutrients, proteins, lipids, carbohydrates, and cells. Okay, it's going to encourage anabolism or use of proteins, but it can actually cause release of fat or lipids that are being stored and encourage their catabolism. Now, catabolism is when the body is going to break down its stores. If the body has anything stored in the fat or in the muscle, when an animal is in a catabolic state, it means they are accessing from non-food sources. So, like, for example, when people get into like the keto diets and they start, it's basically forcing the body to try and break down fat, also breaks down some muscle, but anything that's stored, is when we get into catabolism. And sometimes diseases cause, like cancer, puts animals at a catabolic state because cancer basically needs so much that it'll take from what the animal gets, but then it's also going to break down stores for its energy to spread, unfortunately. Okay. And then it can actually discourage the use of carbohydrates, especially glucose. Basically, growth hormone is balancing the use of, what it needs to grow. Do I need to catabolize for it? And it promotes growth. Now, I'm talking about the normal function of every hormone. Obviously, you have people that if this is overproduced, you get that giantism where people overgrow or are too tall or too big. And then if you have not enough growth hormone, it may be where, people are too small. I mean, there's genetics, and I'm not getting into the whole genetics thing. But if there is a deficiency in this, it's going to affect their growth rate. Now, prolactin basically helps trigger lactation and maintain lactation. The feedback for this hormone, well, basically, when an animal becomes pregnant and they get closer to term, like that last couple weeks before they give birth, you start to see the mammary development. So prolactin, now there's other hormones that develop the mammaries. Basically, prolactin is going to come in when they're about ready to nurse. As long as the teat is being stimulated by nursing or milking, they are going to continue to produce prolactin. The feedback, well, think about it this way. If they fill up a mammary gland, well, okay, let's talk about milk cows. After cows give birth, and a lot of times the calf is taken away from the mother at these large milking facilities. Now they feed the calf, they bottle feed the calf separately, and then they use the cow, and she has these full udders. Well, she is put on a milking machine twice a day. So basically what happens is her mammary gland is completely stripped of milk. The body's going to go, oh, you need more milk. And prolactin is going to maintain that lactation as long as the teat is stimulated. In people, it's how there's certain women, and I'll be quite honest, I have 2 children, I breastfed them, but when I stopped, I wasn't producing as much milk. But some women will continue to pump, and they will bank their milk, or there's milk banks for women that cannot breastfeed or for sick babies in the hospital. So some people will continue to produce milk. If the teat is stimulated, prolactin is going to be stimulated. That's the feedback. Now what happens is when we want, for now, let's go into puppies, weaning puppies. I just bought a puppy. So when little AJ was born and he's nursing off the mother, usually somewhere around weeks 3 to 4, probably closer to 4, they start feeding the puppies like a gruel or a mixture. Sometimes they'll take a little milk from the mother and mix it with like canned food. So they're going to start to wean them to puppy food. Well, when they eat that, they're going to be more full. They're not going to nurse as often. So naturally what happens is if the teat isn't stimulated enough, it's going to slow down production. And then eventually the puppies, usually by weeks 5 to 6, are on complete puppy food and they're not nursing. And then the mother will dry up. Now we're going to do lactation. Lactation is part of our next lecture with reproduction. So I'll get into this a little more. But as long as there's stimulation, prolactin is going to be released. Thyroid stimulating hormone. Thyrotropic, another tropic, somatropic, thyrotropic, growth of the thyroid gland. Thyroid stimulating hormone is TSH. TSH is a thyroid test we do in animals. So when we evaluate an animal for thyroid disease, we have to figure out, is the thyroid disease coming from the thyroid gland, or is there a deficiency of TSH? Okay, so there's two sides to thyroid disease. We have to figure out where the problem is. But in a normal animal, TSH is produced in the anterior pituitary. It is released to maintain growth of the gland. It's also going to tell the thyroid to release its hormones. So what happens is, this is the feedback system, feedback from the thyroid. If thyroid levels are dropping in the blood, thyroid levels are low, okay, the feedback from the thyroid is like, hey, we're low. Hypothalamus sends a releasing factor to the pituitary. The pituitary releases TSH. TSH travels to the thyroid gland and releases thyroid hormone in the blood. The feedback was there wasn't enough thyroid in the blood. And basically, this is an interaction between the hypothalamus, the pituitary, and the thyroid gland. Now, when the thyroid gland spits out thyroid hormone, pituitary detects that thyroid levels have come up. It sends an inhibiting factor to the pituitary. The pituitary sends that inhibiting factor to the thyroid gland. Thyroid hormone is stopped. So does everybody understand the feedback? So if I asked you, let me put it this way. If I asked you, what was I going to ask you? What is the stimulation, or what is the connection, the stimulation to release thyroid hormone? It's because of falling hormone levels in the blood. And what hormone does that? TSH. Okay, so hopefully we're getting the connection there. Now, ACTH, it's one of my favorite words to say, adrenocorticotropic. I don't know why. It's like one of those words that I like. ACTH is a test that we will run in animals when we think they have issues with the adrenal gland. If, you know, and two, you'll hear a lot of this when you're in school. There's a disease called Cushing's disease. And Cushing's disease, there's Cushing's disease is usually an overproduction of hormones from the adrenal gland. And it can cause some classic clinical signs. So ACTH is a test that we will do in practice to screen animals for Cushing. So when you see ACTH, you'll hear this many other times, but the job of ACTH is to basically stimulate growth and development of the adrenal cortex and help release some of its hormones. And basically, it gets feedback from the blood and it gets feedback from the cortex. Now, when I get into the adrenal gland, it is primarily, its hormones primarily deal with stress. And animals need these hormones to deal with stress. And you think, well, what is stressful about my dog's life? Well, they on the couch, they cuddle. No, I mean, if you've ever seen a dog go berserk when somebody rings the doorbell, or when they hear the garage opener, or they hear the garage opening, or they hear you crack a can of food. I mean, there's things that cause excitement. There's things that cause stress. And the hormones of this gland help maintain body functions during those periods. So I'm going to get into that a little bit when I get to the actual gland itself. Now, the reason I always do endocrine towards the end is I do endocrine and reproduction, because a lot of the hormones that I talk about in the endocrine have a direct effect on reproduction. So I feel like these two lectures go together. So follicle stimulating hormone primarily talks about what it does in the female, but it basically stimulates oogenesis, or creation of an ovum or a mature egg that can be fertilized. It will also stimulate so when I say follicle, we haven't done reproduction yet, but there's the ovaries and the uterine horns in the uterus, basic female anatomy. Within the ovary, there is a follicle. And when that follicle is stimulated, that's when it produces an ovum. So when a dog cycles, basically when it's ready for their heat or when they release their egg, but that has started much before they release the egg. In the follicle, there are cells that can be stimulated to become a mature ovum. That starts with FSH, which is produced by the anterior pituitary. So part of the cycle, the estrous cycle or the heat cycle, is managed by hormones in the pituitary gland. There are hormones in the pituitary and there's hormones in the ovaries, and there is a relationship there. Now, big important thing is the stimulation and secretion of estrogen. So that's very important. There is FSH in the male. It stimulates spermatogenesis. So FSH in the male, but basically the egg and the sperm are the reproductive cells for each sex. So FSH, oogenesis, is the female creates the egg, the male creates the sperm. And you see genesis, creation of. Spermato, oogen. Oo is meaning ovum or egg. So when you see the oo, you know, you're like, uh-oh. Now, the second hormone that comes into play is luteinizing hormone. Basically, the ovary is going to create this follicle, and it's going to grow. The follicle is going to kind of grow and grow and grow. And it's developing because it was stimulated by FSH, and estrogen is stimulated. It's kind of like they grow up together. The egg gets bigger, estrogen increases. It's kind of like, oh, you guys were babies, you're growing up together. As an ovum increases, estrogen's going to increase. When the egg is fully developed, basically the body's going to detect that there's high levels of estrogen. It's going to basically, LH is going to start to grow as estrogen is peaking. So when LH peaks is when the follicles mature, it will cause ovulation. And basically ovulation is this follicle's going to pop, or it's going to open, and it's going to release the egg basically into the oviduct, and then it can be fertilized. So LH triggers ovulation. It's basically what starts ovulation. And then something forms called a corpus luteum, luteinizing luteum. Corpus luteum maintains pregnancy. So that's a structure that'll form to maintain pregnancy. And again, I'm going to go more in depth about this in next lecture when we do reproduction. And then the LH in males causes development and maintenance of testosterone. As long as a male dog, anything male that has testicles produces testosterone. Now, it's obviously one of the reasons we talk about castrating male dogs is because sometimes they get a little overzealous in their testosterone production. Now, melanocyte stimulating hormone, I'm not really going to stress this one, but it does, it's basically in charge of maintaining the color or pigment of anything that changes colors. like the reptiles and fish and amphibians. If they can change their color patterns rapidly, then these hormones are going to maintain this. Melanocyte, remember, a melanocyte is a cell that contains melanin, or has a pigment. So melanin is what gives pigment to our skin. Some people have more melanin, some people have less melanin. And a lot of these hormones can be administered artificially, but if you were to do that, you can get darkening of the skin by administering that hormone. Now, those were all anterior pituitary hormones. The two posterior, again, they were produced by the hypothalamus, stored in the posterior pituitary, are the antidiuretic and the oxytocin. So basically, the hypothalamus sends these hormones via these nerve endings, and they are stored. When the hypothalamus gets an impulse to release them, it's going to send a releasing factor to release each one. Now, I've already kind of talked about ADH in the kidney. ADH helps prevent diuresis. Diuresis is releasing of water and increasing urine production. When you give an animal a diuretic, or a person is on a diuretic, we are forcing water to be excreted into the urine at a higher rate. Now, when the hypothalamus detects that there is dehydration, it's going to be sent, ADH goes to the kidney, has receptors for ADH, and ADH is going to cause the kidneys to reabsorb water in those peritubular capillaries, and then water levels increase, hydration improves, and then ADH production is stopped, inhibited, negative feedback. There are animals that are, remember I talked about ADH deficiency? So if an animal is not producing ADH hormone, then there's an actual name for there can be other reasons for this, but there is diabetes insipidus. This has nothing to do with insulin. Diabetes insipidus is usually within the brain. I will say, we had a cat came in for radiation, and she had a pituitary tumor. So they found a little tumor on her pituitary, and we were going to radiate her. This cat, no lie, when I first got to know her, she would literally lay in her water bowl. Her little chin she was wet all the time. She was wet right here, because she'd literally lay in her water bowl and go, and she'd just drink and drink and drink. And she'd wake up from anesthesia. And I was like, I'm not going to let you drown yourself, because sometimes she'd drag herself to her bowl and she's kind of half awake. But she would also, I had to watch her close, because a lot of times she would have urine under her. So she was not doing well. And she ended up not finishing radiation because she ended up having some other issues. But she would live in her water bowl because she was polyuric becoming polydipsic. So in this condition, diabetes insipidus comes, but from a clinical standpoint, if an animal is ADH deficient, they're usually polyuric, and then they're polydipsic. And the result of ADH, again, you're going to get more concentrated urine. Urine concentration has to deal with water level in the urine. The more water you have in your urine, the less concentrated it is. It's going to be more pale color. When urine is concentrated, you're going to get that yellow to dark yellow. If you watch your animal urinate in the morning, it's usually a little bit darker yellow, and as they urinate throughout the day, because they've been basically all night holding their urine. So sometimes when they hold their urine, or they're under the influence of ADH or dehydrated, their urine should be more concentrated. Let me just mention the last one, because I know we're almost done. You gotta get to Nemer. Oxytocin is a reproduction hormone, and it has its effect on the uterus. Produced by the hypothalamus, stored in the posterior pituitary. Its target is the uterus. But this oxytocin initiates uterine contractions when it's time, well, during breeding, but parturition is giving birth. So when it's time to give birth, basically the body's going to detect that the fetus has reached its size. When the hypothalamus detects that, it's going to release oxytocin from the posterior pituitary, and that is what begins contractions. It can also, it also affects the mammary glands and cause something called milk letdown, which I'll get into. But basically, when the pups are released during birth, the milk is stored higher up in the mammary gland. Oxytocin triggers that milk to be let down closer to the teat. And it's like the milk is coming in and then the animal can nurse. So oxytocin is going to initiate that. Yeah, and I was going to say, people are given sometimes a drug called Pitocin, which is a derivative of oxytocin. So if someone said, I received Pitocin, the other thing on, we can do this sometimes when animals come into the ER with dystocia, which means they're not giving birth. If we confirm there is no pup stuck in the canal, we have injectable oxytocin. We will sometimes give them an injection and see if they will pass on their own, see if they will pass the pup on their own. Again, if a pup is stuck, oh, all right, I will finish talking about this. Sorry, you guys have to, I appreciate it. I'm not trying to, all right, don't get in trouble. I'll convert this lecture and